Alright, so as promised, now let's go ahead and dive into what file processing actually looks like when you write it using Python code. So as mentioned earlier, there's sort of 3 steps that you're going to be doing with all this file processing stuff. First step is open, second step is process, third step is close. So let's first talk about open and what that looks like in Python code. So the general form of how you open a file in Python looks like this. So left hand side we have a variable. This is an assignment statement. Right hand side, this is a function call to a built-in function called open. Here you can see open has 2 arguments that you have to give it. So the first argument that you give is file name. Now this is going to be both the file name and the extension. And then the second argument is this thing called the mode. We'll talk about that in a second. But again, this is the general form of how you open a file in Python code. Now this is what the code that you need to use is to create that file object that we talked about before. So again, the file object is sort of the representation of the other file in your code itself. So this line of code opens the file by creating a file object in your code and associates it with the specified file. We'll go into a couple of detailed examples in a bit, so hang tight for a little bit while I talk about general form stuff. Alright, so on the left hand side, this file variable, this is just the name of the variable that is going to refer to the file object. So this can be any variable name as long as it adheres to the Python variable name rules and guidelines. And then file name, that first argument to the open function call, that is going to be the name of the file including the extension. So it's the file name dot the extension, and the file name here has to be a string. So just make sure you also include the quotes with the file name. The second argument that you're going to give it is the mode. So the mode for this class is either going to be reading or writing. So when you first create a file object in Python, when you first say, hey Python, I'm going to work with this other file on the computer, you have to tell Python right away whether you are using it for reading, meaning you're reading information from the other file, or if you're going to write information to the other file. You have to choose one or the other, otherwise weird things can happen. So mode, again, the second argument here, this is going to be a string. So the string is either going to be R or W. There are a couple other modes that the textbook covers, but for this class we're just going to focus on these 2 modes, R and W. So use the string R if you want to open a file for reading, right? R for reading, makes sense. The only caveat here is that since it's expected that you're going to be reading information from the file, that file that you're opening for reading, it needs to exist. And this is potentially where you could find some error messages. If you type the file name incorrectly, if you spell it wrong, if you miss a capital letter, if you forget the extension, stuff like that can potentially cause error messages because maybe it can't find the file. So again, when you're using R as the mode for reading, the file that you're reading from needs to be there. It has to exist. The other option for mode, as I mentioned, is writing. So this is just the string with a lowercase w in it. So the way this mode works, if the file already exists, it will erase any of the previous content. So again, we are working with files that use sequential access to read and write data. So that means if we say, hey Python, I'm going to write stuff to this file, it's going to start at the very beginning and basically overwrite anything that was in there from before. If the file doesn't exist, if you're writing, that is okay. So again, if you're reading stuff, the file has to exist, which makes sense because how can you read stuff from a file if it's not there? But you can write stuff to a file because there doesn't need to be information in the file before you write stuff to it. So again, if the file doesn't exist, it will make the file for you, which is pretty convenient, and then it also, creates this file object that you have in your Python code. And then later on in your code, you can refer to this file object to do stuff with the file. One thing that I do want to mention before we get into specific examples is file location. So file location matters. Now, what I mean by this is, for this stuff, we're going to have our Python file, which is, our .py file that we save on our computer, and then there's going to be at least one other file that we're using with our code. To make it easy on yourself, just make sure that your Python code is saved to the same folder as any file that you're using with the Python code. So save them to the same folder or save them both on desktop, whatever works for you. There are ways around this, but the ways around it depend on which operating system you're using, which can get a little bit confusing because, we all have different types of computers. So just to make it easiest on everyone, make sure whenever you're doing this file stuff, save your code and the files you're working with into the same exact folder, same place on your computer. Alright, so again, I mentioned the 3 steps is open, process, close. Now, process, there's a lot involved there, right? And the process is going to be dependent on what you want to do with the files. So we'll talk about that more in depth in a bit. But now I want to highlight how you close a file. So this is an example of sort of these 3 steps. This first line of code shows the first step, which we talked about already, the open step. So this is creating a file object. It's storing it into a variable called numFile. And it's opening a file called nums.txt. Now, this is assuming that there is already a file called nums.txt saved in the same location as wherever this code is saved, and it's assuming that because there's that R there for the mode. So again, that R means we're opening it for reading, and if we're opening something for reading, that means this file has to exist. There will be a couple of examples later on in these videos where we process data from a file called nums.txt. This nums.txt, you can download that file right off of Canvas, so just make sure when you download it, just save it to the same folder where you're writing your code for these video demos. So again, that's the first line there. The second line, this is just a comment for now, but presumably this processing data will be involved. There will be a lot of code here. And then this third line represents how you can close a file. So remember, I said it's really important to make sure you remember you close your files. So generally, whenever I am doing this file processing stuff in Python, I will always write these 2 lines of code first. So I'll first write the open line, and then I'll press enter a couple of times, and I'll immediately write the close line. Then I'll come back and then put stuff in the middle that actually processes the data. The reason why I always write my close line with my open line is because if I don't, sometimes I will forget to have the close line there. And again, if you forget the close line, it can do weird things. It might not save everything that you write. It might leave the file empty. It might corrupt the file. Corrupting the file isn't as bad as it sounds, trust me, it's okay. But it will just make it so that you can't open it, for example. So just make sure, good practice, the second you do one of these open commands, the second you call open, go ahead and close that file object. And then you can do, more code in the middle there. Alright, so let's first talk about, now that we've seen how you open a file and how you close a file, let's start talking about, sort of this middle process stage. So first let's talk about writing. Writing is easier than reading. So let's first talk about writing. So the way you write to a file, now this is assuming that we've already opened the file. So this has already created the file object earlier on, and this is the general form. In this case, the file variable, that's the same variable that you used with open, and then you just do .write. This is a built-in Python command, and then the argument that you give it is whatever you want to write to the file. Now, a couple things to note about this. This is only going to work if the file was open for writing. So remember, when you use that open command, you give it either an R or a W. The write command will only work if you give it a W when you open it. Other thing to watch out for is you can only write strings. So whatever you write, whatever you put in that argument there, it has to be of type string. So that means, for example, if you have any numerical data you want to put into another file, you have to first convert that numerical data to a string. Alright, so here's an example. So I want you to go ahead and create a file. Go ahead, create a Python file. I should be specific now that we're working with other files. So go ahead and make a new file in Python and add these 5 lines of code. Now you'll note, the first line here, that's the first stage, right? That's the opening stage. The last line here, that's the closing stage. And then the middle 3 lines, that's sort of the processing stage. So go ahead and write these lines of code, save your file and run it and see what happens. And I will do it with you as well. Alright, so hopefully your file looks like this. And now let's go ahead and run this. Now you'll see, maybe you didn't see it over here, but over here in this right corner of my screen, there's this new file that popped up called courses.txt. Alright, so if I open this new file that came up, it looks like this. So let's go back and look at this code more closely. So this first line of code right here, that's saying, hey Python, I am opening this file, courses.txt, so it's going to be named this. You can see here, it matches up here with that name. I'm opening it for writing, which means I'm going to write new stuff to it. This is creating the file object. The file object is being stored in this variable. So now at any point in time, since I've opened it for writing, I can then say, hey, that variable, go ahead and write whatever strings you want. And I write 3 different strings. So again, this is sequential access. So the order in which you write stuff is the order in which stuff will show up in your file. So you can see here, I wrote CSC 110, and that's right here. I wrote CSC 142, and that's right here, and so on. One thing that I do want to point out is when you are writing stuff to files, if you want stuff in your files to show up on different lines, you explicitly need to type those new line characters. Remember \n, that is a new line character, and you'll see how I have these 2 new line characters that says, hey Python, go ahead and make new lines right here. And then the very last thing I do want to point out is when you are done processing, make sure you always close your file as well. And you use the same variable name that you used here when you want to close your file. So make sure whenever you're doing this file stuff, open, close, and then in the middle, you can do your process. Alright, so at this point in time, I want you to use this previous example that we just did and go ahead and make your own Python code that will create a file with the names of your family members in the file, 1 on each line. And you can, name it, let's say, familymembers.txt. So go ahead and try that activity, and when you're ready, come back and watch the next video.